Hey everyone, it's Sevy. Dr. Veritas Ratio is finally here and ready to school our enemies into submission. Trailblazers will be getting a free copy of him, which was a huge surprise. But despite being free, he's actually a very good unit and is all the more worthwhile to build if your roster is in need of more carries. So to help you understand this candid genius better, this guide will cover his kit and traces, Eidolons, best relic and light cone builds, team synergies, and more. Let's begin.
Ignorance is a malady that must be cured.
Dr. Ratio is an Imaginary Hunt DPS that deals a lot of single target damage, largely thanks to his frequent and strong follow-up attacks, with a playstyle that takes advantage of debuffs on enemies. Let's take a look at his traces and examine how he works. Dr. Ratio's skill deals imaginary damage to one target, pretty straightforward, but what turns this into a deadlier combo is his talent's follow-up attack mechanic. Using his skill has an initial 40% fixed chance to deal a follow-up attack to the same target. However, it gains 20% more chance for every debuff the enemy has. You can see the actual percent chance displayed on top of every enemy while selecting a target. If you're not sure what counts as a debuff, you can also check the enemy stat page during battle and look at the effects category or the debuff count at the bottom, or you can look at the status icon and see if it has a downward red arrow, which indicates that it is a debuff. If the enemy dies from his skill attack, the follow-up attack will still launch and target another random enemy, so at least it's not wasted. Essentially, his skill is meant to deal 2 attacks in a row, being the actual skill damage and the follow-up damage. Not only is that HP damage, but that's also dealing good toughness damage. Maintaining debuffs on the enemy will ensure this triggers consistently, and Dr. Ratio himself can actually apply debuffs, but a debuff applying teammate, equipment, or certain simulated universe blessings will further help guarantee this. Then his ultimate deals bigger single target damage and applies the Wise Man's Folly status on an enemy. Quick note though, this status isn't counted as a debuff, so it won't affect his talent's trigger chance. Rather, it's counted under the category of other effects and not adding to the debuff count, as you can see from the enemy status page. If any other ally attacks a target affected by this status, it causes Dr. Ratio to also launch a coordinated follow-up attack, which can be triggered up to 2 times. Although if Dr. Ratio uses a skill on an affected target to trigger his own follow-up attack, he will not consume the Wise Man's Folly trigger, so it's really only for his teammates. However, if an enemy dies from his ultimate, or while there are still remaining stacks, the Wise Man's Folly status will not be transferred to another enemy. You're typically going to have a 3-turn recharge time by spamming his skill, getting energy from follow-ups, and getting external energy, usually from killing enemies or getting hit. Other external sources like allies, equipment, blessing conditions, or battle conditions can also contribute and expedite his recharge time. For his technique, casting it creates a dimension with a sculpture of him that taunts enemies. When you enter battle while this is active, there's a 100% base chance to debuff all enemy speed for 2 turns. So aside from slowing them down, it also helps with increasing his follow-up attack chance at the beginning of battles. Now for his Ascension bonus abilities. With the Ascension 2 passive, using Dr. Ratio's skill allows him to gain a crit buff stack for every debuff on the target. Each stack gives 2.5% crit rate and 5% crit damage, and can stack up to 6 times for a max of 15% and 30% respectively. This helps a lot for boosting his damage and makes balancing his crit stats much easier. For Ascension 4, his skill now has a 100% base chance to apply an effect resistance debuff on a target that lasts for 2 turns. This also counts as a debuff to help with his follow-up attack chance, and it'll overall lower your entire team's effect hit rate stat target needed to more reliably apply debuff effects on the enemy. For Ascension 6, if Dr. Ratio is damaging an enemy with at least 3 debuffs, his attack gets a 10% damage bonus for each debuff, maxing up to 5 debuffs or 50% damage bonus. It's a good damage boost and incentive to maintain a couple of debuffs on his targets, aside from his follow-up attack trigger chance. For his stat bonus traces, he gains useful attack and crit rate stats, with a bit of defense for some added survivability. Then focus on leveling his talent trace, as this is his main damage source, followed by his skill, then ultimate traces. Leave his basic attack alone to save resources. Dr. Ratio at E0 is already really good, so only players who really like him should consider pulling Eidolons. Let's check what they add. With E1, his A2 passive gets 4 additional max stacks, which is an extra 10% crit rate and 20% crit damage. Additionally, he starts every battle with 4 summation stacks, giving him a good head start in ramping up his crit. For E2, when his follow-up attack hits a target, he additionally deals a separate imaginary hit based on 20% of his attack for every debuff on the enemy, which can stack up to 4 times or 80% attack total. E3 increases his ultimate and basic attack levels, which are his least valuable traces. For E4, when triggering Dr. Ratio's talent, he gains an additional 15 energy, which helps a ton with his ult recharge time. This can help enable a consistent 2-turn ult rotation, which means a lot more chances to trigger follow-up attacks with his ultimate Wise Man's Folly status. E5 increases his skill and talent levels, which are more significant. Finally, E6 increases the trigger count of Wise Man's Folly by 1, and Dr. Ratio's follow-up attack gets a 50% damage increase. Basically, more follow-up attack triggers and higher follow-up attack damage. Now let's move on to his relic build, starting with his stats. For his body piece, use either crit rate or crit damage, whichever will give you a good balanced crit ratio. Just remember to factor in his crit rate bonuses that apply in battle. For the feat piece, go for speed or attack. Speed is generally recommended for faster turn cycling, but attack will also be good if you have external speed buffs or action advance effects to help him. For the planar sphere, go for attack or imaginary damage boost. The gap can vary depending on how much damage bonus and attack buffs he's getting from other sources, and of course the piece's substat quality. You generally want to balance his damage percent bonus if he's getting a lot of attack, and vice versa. And for the link rope, go for attack percent. For substats, you mainly want crit, attack, and speed. Get enough speed to reach your target speed breakpoint. Break effect is lower priority, but it's also not entirely terrible if you get a few stray rolls, as that will boost his break damage and increase his imprisonment delay duration. For his relic sets, an efficient route is to go for 2-piece set combos of imaginary damage, follow-up attack damage, attack, or speed. This can be easier to farm, and it'll give you more flexibility to choose pieces with the right main stats and better substats that can be competitive with 4-piece sets. For full sets, the 4-piece Wastelander or 4-piece Genius sets are your top main options. The 4-piece Wastelander of Banditry Desert gives imaginary damage and a 10% crit rate buff by attacking a debuffed enemy, which is expected. The crit damage bonus needs him to attack imprisoned enemies, which can be applied either by making Dr. Ratio or any other imaginary unit break the enemy, or using Welt's ult to apply imprisonment. Remember to factor in its crit bonuses when you're balancing his crit ratio as well. Meanwhile, the 4-piece Genius of Brilliant Stars potential is in the 4-piece effect, which gives a total 20% defense ignore versus quantum weak enemies, which is quite potent, more so when combined with defense shredding effects like Dr. Ratio's signature Light Cone or defense shredding allies. If the enemy isn't quantum weak, having Silver Wolf in the team can force that, but since the Wastelander set can still offer a useful 2-piece set to combine with other sets, that can generally be more efficient and faster to farm instead. If you're in the early game or just happen to have really good pieces, the 4-piece Musketeer is also still a good option, as it still gives attack and speed bonuses that he appreciates. If you're wondering about the 4-piece Grand Duke, which buffs follow-up attacks, there's a big caveat to consider with it. Dr. Ratio's follow-up attack at E0 to E1 only deals 1 instance of damage, so that means he can only get 1 stack or 6% attack bonus, which makes the 4-piece effect very underutilized on him, and just going for a 2-piece set combo will be much better. However, I wasn't able to verify if his E2's additional damage instances are counted towards the stack, but if they are, then this does gain some more potency, but that's a very specific situation. I'll try to double check this and update you in the pinned comment if that's the case. As for planar ornaments, the Inert Salsoto is his general top set, as it gives an 8% crit rate and a 15% damage bonus to ultimates and follow-up attacks. The 50% crit rate requirement to unlock this bonus is also very easy to achieve with his crit bonuses. The downside is that it shares a world with the Belobog defense set, which has very limited use, so farming this set generally isn't as efficient. Alternatively, the Space Sailing Station and Firmament Frontline Glamoth are very close contenders while being more efficient to farm. The Glamoth set does have higher speed requirements for its extra bonus, so be mindful of how much speed your Dr. Ratio gets. Now for his Light Cones, which has great choices from free to gacha options. Cruising in the Stellar Sea is a free-to-play friendly but very good option from Herta's store. It gives high base stats, a crit rate bonus that doubles against enemies with half or less HP, and a 2-turn attack bonus after the user defeats an enemy. It does rely on killing enemies to achieve its full potential, so it depends on your combat scenario how consistent the performance is. With max superimpositions, this will be one of Dr. Ratio's top light cones accessible to everyone. For gacha light cones, Swordplay is a competitive 4-star option option since it gives a huge stacking damage percent bonus from hitting the enemy, especially with superimpositions. However, Dr. Ratio's attacks are only single hits, so it just needs to ramp up a bit first to achieve max stacks on one target, and switching targets will reset its stack and cause damage inconsistencies. But with E2, the 4 additional hits on his follow-up attack should help this ramp up sooner. Only Silence Remains is also a good option, though a bit more situational. While it gives a permanent attack bonus, the crit rate bonus only triggers if there are 2 or less enemies. As such, it won't be as consistent in multi-target scenarios, especially if bosses can summon minions. For 5 stars, his signature light cone is Baptism of Pure Thought, which adds to the collection of topless backshot light cones. Comet 2 did it better. It boasts high base stats, a crit damage bonus, plus a stacking crit damage buff based on how many debuffs are on the enemy. It also gives the user the disruption effect upon using their ultimate, which gives a damage bonus and makes their follow-up attack ignore a portion of the enemy's defense. All these combined are crazy good buffs for his kit. If you have Topaz and Numby's signature light cone, Worrisome Blissful, it also has very good synergy with his kit thanks to its follow-up attack related effect. So you generally want it on Topaz, unless you have this but don't have her for some reason, or won't use them in the same team. Zealous in the Night is also fine as a crit stat stick, and it'll buff his ult and skill attacks, but unfortunately, its damage bonuses won't affect follow-up attacks. Sleep Like the Dead, the standard 5-star light cone, is also an okay stat stick option, though the crit rate bonus has a cooldown period, and you'll want to time its uptime with his ult's uptime too. Now for Dr. Ratio's team considerations. As some general criteria to start, Dr. Ratio is a skill point hungry DPS, so you'll want a team with good SP management to feed him SP. Be mindful how SP hungry his teammates are, and if you need to balance it with other SP positive units. Debuff applicators will also help ensure that his talent chance and A6 passive will be maximized. It's not just Nihility units that can fit this criteria, as there are abilities from non-Nihility units and light cones from different paths that can also apply debuffs. And remember as well that Dr. Ratio can apply his own debuff with his Ascension 4 passive and his technique at the start of battle. Breaking enemies, whether it's by Dr. Ratio himself or allies, can also be a debuff source by applying the corresponding elemental break effects. Keeping those points in mind, he can fit into a dual carry team with a synergistic carry or a hyper carry comp where his teammates are focused on boosting his damage. For a dual carry team, if you have Topaz and Numby, their follow-up synergy is amazing. Topaz amplifies follow-up attack damage, her mark is considered a debuff, and Numby moves faster by having allies deal follow-up attacks to enemies, which combos well with Dr. Ratio's own follow-up attacks and results in a barrage of single target damage. And if the enemies have both fire and imaginary weaknesses, their combined attacks also result in fast breaking capabilities. It's great to see that those who pulled for Topaz and Numby are getting a free 5-star that highly complements her. Other dual DPS teams are of course possible, like Welt, who can be built as an imaginary DPS, or dot units who are both dealing damage and applying dot debuffs. Again, a big consideration is making sure you can generate the SP needed for both DPS units to function properly. Other DPSs just don't have as much dual carry synergy with him, which becomes a bigger concern in harder content where optimizing is important. A support that can easily buff both your DPS units' damage are generally more preferable for dual carries too. In my experience, I often used Runmei for her convenient team-wide buffs, or Silverwolf, whose debuffs will amplify the damage your party deals to an enemy, but of course there are other variations. Alternatively, you can slot Dr. Ratio into a hyper carry team where he's generally accompanied by Harmony and or Nihility supports that will help increase his damage, and a sustained support. Harmony supports have their own set of buffs and utilities, and more importantly, unique advantages, like Bronya's Advance Forward, Runmei's break-related buffs, Tingyun's Energy Battery, and so on. I've made a guide on all of them already, so if you're not that familiar yet with what someone does, you can go check out a specific character's video to see how they work. On the other hand, Nihility units are more focused on debuffing enemies to amplify the team's damage. Silverwolf is going to be a great pair with Dr. Ratio, as she can apply a lot of different single-target debuffs that will complement Dr. Ratio's synergy with debuffing enemies. She can also force weaknesses on enemies on top of defense shredding, which results in amplifying damage and creating more breaking opportunities. Alternatively, Pela's a good choice thanks to her defense shred, while Gwenaifen and Luca can apply dot and vulnerability debuffs, all of which have naturally SP positive playstyles. Welt can also be quite good with Dr. Ratio, as he can debuff to significantly delay enemy turns, increase the damage they take, and sub DPS if you build him for damage too. Combining their imaginary toughness damage can result in really fast breaking versus imaginary weak enemies. And if you like imagining stuff, then you could run a mono mono imaginary team with Dr. Ratio as your main carry, Luocha as your sustain, and Yukong, Welt, and Silverwolf as the support or sub DPS options. Silverwolf again being useful if you need to force an imaginary weakness on enemies or just to debuff them in general. Having all that combined imaginary toughness damage can potentially help you inflict break imprisonment faster and more reliably too, which will be especially useful if you're running the Wastelander set to better maximize its 4-piece bonus. Of course, these won't cover all the possible team variations, and you should ultimately tailor your team according to what you have, your preferences, and the combat scenario. As for Dr. Ratio's auto-battle behavior, he pretty much plays out as you'd expect. He uses his skill every turn as long as there's SP available and typically targets the elite or boss enemies over minions. Though there are some cases where he will target a smaller enemy, it generally seems to default back to the main elite or boss. Of course, there are some scenarios where prioritizing other enemies aside from the main bosses have more strategic value, so don't expect the auto-battle to perform ideally in those nuanced scenarios. He also uses his ultimate as soon as it's available with the same target priority, and his teammates will also generally hit the enemy affected with Wise Man's Folly, so there's not much problem in ensuring that his extra follow-up attacks will be consumed. So in general, as long as his teammates have a combined SP positive playstyle, he'll more or less do his job as a single target follow-up attack DPS. If you're using him in a dual carry comp, using a team-wide buffer or enemy debuffer will be convenient, so both your carries' damage are affected. But if ever you run a single target buffer, just watch out who they will prioritize their buffs on. And that's it for this Dr. Ratio guide. I think he brings a lot of value to players who somewhat recently started and don't have a good selection of DPS units yet, or specifically need a good imaginary carry, particularly because they didn't pull Imbibitor Lunae or can't hyper-invest in Welt. Though, if you're already well stocked on DPSs, then I think there's less incentive to direct your resources to Dr. Ratio, especially if you're still in the process of raising them and their relevant supports or farming their relics. Either way, it's just a big W that we're getting him for free, and at least he'll be there waiting if ever you want him to teach you a lesson. I'm interested to know in the comments what you think of Dr. Ratio and what teammates you'll be playing him with. If this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!